Okay, so first of all, let me welcome everybody for coming. Some of you have travelled an extraordinarily long way today, and I'm grateful to you for your efforts. Without wishing to sound like a James Bond villain or Blofeld, I have been expecting you. Okay, I have been expecting you for a long time. What you will find today is that the value of being here is the ideation, the energy, the synthesis of being with like-minded entities, people who really get the need to move forward with design that impacts upon standards in learning, other outcomes and well-being. And I think, as you'll see when I talk a little bit more, the risk of moving forward, the risk of developing these environments is actually a lot less than the risk of staying still. I've talked to Joanne a little bit about where she's going to go to China, Bart a little bit, Joe a little bit, everybody a little bit. Everyone who is here is fully engaged with the start of the journey. And the aim of the game today is to go from a teacher and a manager of teaching and learning to being a design thinker. So that's why you're here. So the aim of the game, ideate, create, focus, synthesize, energize, go home with a design, and above all else, have a really good time. Speaking of which, Rishi, our vodka aficionado, to whom I'll introduce you to today, has at the end of the day, to keep you here and to keep you engaged, some nibbles and drinks, he tells me. But the last time we asked him about drinks, I do believe a bottle of vodka appeared from behind the bar. So without any further references to whatever cultures go on here, let me introduce you to the team who've made this possible. First of all, we've got Rishi and Nathan and their team from KI. They're our partners. Their knowledge of design is exemplary as they walk and talk you through the environments you see here, the habitat, so to speak. The depth of knowledge is vast, and hopefully you'll begin to recycle that into some of your own design. And we're very grateful to them for having us as their strategic partners. At Enverplan and Noble and Eaton, I'll let the team introduce themselves, but before I go any further, I just want to say a huge thank you to Bruce and Glyn, the directors of Enverplan, for having the courage and the vision to move forward with developing schools and education in this way. I think the only precursor to creativity is courage. If you don't have the courage to move, you can't be creative. And Glyn and Bruce have put heart, mind, soul into this today. I want to thank them very much for making sure that we move forward with our thinking about how design affects learning. And thank you again for coming such a long way, and thanks again to KI for hosting us. So let's make a start. I've tried not to put everything down on PowerPoint slides because I think the point of coming here today is to thrive off the energy and make sure we build strong friendships and create on the basis of what we see and how we interact with those around us and how we interact with the environment. So there were two questions. I always like to start these kind of Socratic, quasi-Harkness talk-throughs with some questions to frame our thinking. And I think the first one I'd ask myself as an ex-international head teacher of 3 years, a domestic head of 14 years, is why as a nation do we accept poor design? Because we do. We do. We accept things in our schools that we would not accept in our homes. And it's a simple fact of life. Why we do that, we can think about today. It's not a question to which I have an answer, but I think if we delve into that a little bit more, hopefully, along with Joe's help, we can begin to cascade our thinking. But what there is in our own environments that we could and we should put into scholastic ones. And why we accept them, big question mark. Where it leads, for those of you old enough to remember, it leads to the Austin Allegro, the Mini Metro, the Maxi, and other cars that were complete failures in the 70s. And it happened because people accepted bad design. They didn't do anything about it. My second thought is this. Why, again, as a nation and possibly as a species, are we so slow at reacting to technology and research? Much of the thinking you'll hear about today is not new. It goes back to Vygotsky et al. Back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. The Soviets thinking about how schools, the standards would be impacted by how the environment was measured, was cleverly designed to get what they wanted from it, and then another bundle of research in the 70s and 80s, and little dribs and drabs here and there, but not anything collegiate, cogent or collective. So I think that's the real advantage of today. We get a chance to begin to think how we can draw upon that research. I know Mike is going to reference some of it, I will reference some of it, but it's not new. And if we all have phones with us, we all probably have touchscreen phones by now. Touchscreen technology came out in the early 90s. Again, as a species, we're actually quite slow to react to it. But that's probably because IBM first developed it and guess what their name for their first phone was? It was the Simon. So I can't imagine many people going into a store and saying, "Can I have an IBM Simon, please?" You know, it's just not going to work. And it took Apple to come along 2005, 2006, and Jobs said, "Look, you know, I want people to dribble on those icons. They look and they feel so good." And so, well, to extrapolate that today, when you walk around, I don't want you dribbling on the environment, but you get the idea. You know, that apparently the saliva really spoils the designs. So that's the aim of the game, that, you know, we engage with our technology at a more rapid pace, we bring it into our schools, and we accept no less a standard than we would at home. I know with my own children, an acid test of being in school, any school I've run or been in, would you allow your own children to go through that system? If the answer is no, you've either got to do something about it or you've got to leave. And I think the same applies to the designed environment. If you don't think it's suitable for your own children, why do you accept it in school? And I'll park that thought there as an opener. So, the opening slide, Lewis, can we just move on to the opener there? That's our agenda, which is in your workbook, by the way. Student-centric environments, how to make them and how to make them work. Obviously, the physical process of how to make them, you can come to our factory for a tour at any time, and you can see all the banding machines and so on, and you'll see them being made. But the big question, the precursor to that, is how do we design them? How do we think about them? How do we create them in schools? Where do we begin? Can we just have a look at the text under that one, please, Lewis? You'll all be familiar with that quote. Mind is like a parachute, it works best when it's open. It's an old quote, and it's one I've often used. I think it applies to British education as a whole. It probably doesn't apply to you, because the irony is you are here because your mind is already open to this as a concept. You understand, I am certain, that the environment is the one thing you have 100% control over. You don't have 100% control over your pupils. In fact, you probably only have about 10%. You certainly don't have 100% control over your staff. No matter what CPD you put in place, what directives you put in place, they will only come so far. And therefore, and I go back to my original background as a professional sportsman, what is there in that competitive environment that you can control? It is the environment. You can design that environment to whatever extent you want it to work at, whatever level you want it to work at, you can do it. You have 100% control over it. And why education as a global entity has been so slow to work that out, I don't know. Probably the Scandinavians and the Italians are a long way ahead of anybody else. I think the Scandinavians nailed this years ago, back in the 40s and 50s, maybe because the Soviets were their neighbours and they thought they needed to get ahead of the game. They understood that the environment was effectively the third teacher. The environment could allow people to personalise their learning pathways. And of course, once you facilitate that engagement, give people ownership, the only corollary to that is that standards improve. People feel happier, they work harder, they have ownership. Right, so how do we make them work? Lewis? Are you okay? Are we not moving? Okay, we are. Have we gone a little bit too far? We've skipped a slide there. We should be back on the original one. Okay, we've just skipped one. It doesn't matter. There were a couple more thoughts I wanted to talk about before we got to the design thinking. The first one is, what do we want from our environments? The big question in my mind, post-COVID and certainly pre-COVID, I started working with Zoom in 2012, much against my better judgment, and actually wrote a paper for University of Wales in 2013. And during these past 2 years, I do wonder, with so much content, so much knowledge available online, in such a way you can do your GCSEs, your A-levels, your degrees, almost in a remote way. Therefore, what is the function of school? What is school now going to give people that they cannot get online? And I think the answer probably lies in three core attributes. And I heard this first at HMC, and unfortunately I don't think that many heads got it. They did that British thing, and probably the key thing went over a lot of people's heads, but a few did. And that was, from our environments, we want to make people accountable. People have to understand that whatever they do, there is accountability. You cannot and you should not get away with saying the algorithm made me do it. So within our learning environments at school, is accountability embedded in the way people interact, in the way they function, in the way they react to the tasks they are given. The second one, and for me probably the major one, is creativity and innovation. If those environments do not foster creativity and innovation, presumably they're not doing what they should be doing. And the last one is empathy. You'll have probably heard the story about how many of the world's greatest inventions, innovations and so on are generated by teams, about 85, 90%. If you don't empathise, how can you have a team? If you don't see things from the other person's point of view. Think about how NASA put the first people on the moon. The biologists, the chemists, the physicists, the telemetricists, they did not work in vacuums. They worked in a collegiate manner, and the precursor to that was empathy, understanding what the other person was saying. So if we retain our command and control environments that are legacies from Victorian times, and I think they were probably dead in the water 100 years ago, and they certainly are now, how can we generate empathy? It's a really big question. So, on to design thinking. It does what it says on the tin. I've a little quote up there from Leah, and for those of you who know my background, Claire is one, and I think others of you know my love of English. Leah is a real symbol of what happens when you can't change. He has a complete nervous breakdown when he tries to change. He can't do it, he can't embrace change, and I don't want us to be in that position, and I don't want British education to be in that position. So he looks at himself and he looks at the people around him. He said, look, is this all we are? Can we not change? So to make it happen, you as design thinkers on that journey from being teachers, it's got to be user orientated. You must be able to empathise with your students. There must be some kind of innovation there. My favourite innovation, and bearing in mind I'm now 7 years into this journey, I started much against my better wishes in 2015 in Swansea, and the CEO said to me, look Adam, will you create a more self-directed learning environment, a little bit like Harkness, a bit pedagogical? I said no, I do PhDs, that's where I'm from. But he was very persuasive, and I think Bruce and Glyn know him, and he really sold the vision to me. And I said, okay, I'll try and craft a system. And we stripped out the whole middle floor of the building and created an environment not dissimilar to this. But I was experimenting, and my experimentation, luckily, was largely right, because it was based on empathy. I was trying to think what you would need as a teenager, a young teenager, a KS3 or a KS4, a pre-university graduate in A-level. What do you need from this environment to be successful? How do you develop the skills that will bridge into university? And Joanne and I had a conversation about that earlier on. What is the value now of sixth form? If much A-level content can be delivered online, what is school going to give you? Where do we innovate? How do we innovate? So one of my first innovations that Bruce and Glyn have built on at Enverplan was the railway carriage, although I called them the Costa coffee booths at the time. And we put them full of writable surfaces. And I don't know if any of you have schools with writable surfaces on. They are hugely iterative. They're real drivers for creativity and literacy. I'm watching my sixth formers go to town on fairly academic tasks, big questions like, show me a tragedy and I'll show you a hero, discuss. Watching them scroll all their thinking, iteratively, and ideate on these writable surfaces in these railway carriages, which I thought would look a little bit like the future. I'd looked at Google Town. It was quite remarkable. So I think when you're thinking about the design of your environments, don't be afraid to be innovative. Think about what it is your A-level graduates, your KS3s, your KS4s, your early years are going to need to be successful in 2030 and 2040. It's very unlikely that the core attributes they require will come from traditional learning environments. For those of you who know Microsoft are great believers in continuous feedback between end users and developers. So those data captures with your sixth formers, your KS3s, your KS4s, your early years, your KS2s, your staff, critical. Bruce and I were in a lovely school in Birmingham this week doing that kind of session with sixth form and pre-sixth form. It was a hugely interactive session, making great use of post-it notes and visuals, and the sixth formers demonstrating to us what it was they felt could and should come out of those environments. And we tried to draw from them some core words. We got words like, I want to feel safe. I don't want command and control and Sir shouting at me. I want to feel loved, which I thought was a great one. Motivated. Inspired. These, and the best one, which I'm sure Bruce will remember, swag. We want some swag in that environment. So when we come into it, it gives us the confidence to believe in ourselves. So when we leave sixth form, when we get to university and we go on the course of our chosen careers, we go about it with a bit of swagger. We might get it wrong occasionally, but we're confident and we believe in ourselves. So thinking about what people need from those environments is absolutely critical. So design thinkers, which is what we do, and I'm grateful to Roberto and the team for helping me understand how design thought works. You've got to step into the end user's shoes. Interview, critical. Observing behaviours, critical. Next stage in my thinking is this: the solutions and the ideas are concretized and communicated in those prototypes. Don't be afraid to generate prototypes. Roberto is here today. You can begin to ideate and iterate some of that prototypical thinking with him. You probably can't test them, although you can with your colleagues when you go home. Certainly Rishi and Nathan have had us test some of their wonderful furniture. This, believe it or not, even at 18 stone, you can, whoops, make sure I don't miss it. You can sit on it right on the edge, and it's incredibly comfortable. It engages your core. You sit there and you stand up and you think, well, I like this. This is the benefit, I think, of working with innovative furniture. This is even better. I love this. This is like a balance ball, and it forces you've got to engage your core. If your core is not engaged, you fall off. So for your ADHDers, anybody who's a fidget spinner, you kind of get them engaged with their furniture. So the point is, you can experiment a little bit, and I know Rishi and Nathan do encourage that. And today, when you get to the seating area, don't be afraid to have a go. Even the whoppers can perch on the edge of that, and it won't go anywhere. And I'm sure Rishi will tell you about the English National Ballet, whom they got perched on this in some fascinating formats, but unfortunately couldn't put out there for fear people might experiment too much and fall off. Okay, so design thinking, practical and extremely impressive results. If I go back to my original premise of being a skeptic, I really, really didn't think this would work. And then 2016, after 1 year of experimentation, redesigning the curriculum, turning pedagogy from being very teacher-led, more into heutagogy, but not quite all the way there, sort of that self-determined learning. My value added goes from, should we say, plus 0.9 to plus 1.51, and I think, wow, that's a huge increase at GCSE. Second year, it goes to plus 1.91. So I'm thinking now, if CATS or whatever it is you use, Midius, doesn't matter, if they're saying you get a C, you're going to get an A. And this is happening at A level too, up to plus 1.4. Now, when I started to work internationally, Isle of Man, Africa, you think, and you'll see this from the research in a minute, you think, well, hold on, maybe it just works in the one environment. Does it transport itself effectively? Which I know is a question Jo will be keen to explore because she's running Wickham Abbey in China. The unequivocal, unambiguous answer is yes. The crafted, designed environment works wherever I took it. My best results ever, last summer, CIS Lagos, plus 1.98, so almost 2 grades of improvement. But what else came out of that was remarkable. Girls' STEM went off the Richter scale. So we had girls incredibly excited with their science because they were allowed to experiment and engage. Again, off the back of that, we got a fantastic arrangement with MIT, who would dial in once a week and do a joint session with our girls. For those of you familiar with GL assessments pass, pupils' attitude to self from school, the school looked like a different place from the previous year, where there were lots of reds on those bar charts. They were mostly green, and years 7, 8 and 9 looked as if they'd gone to a different school. And really all we changed mostly were the learning environments and created these self-directed learning areas and a culture of self-direction through recrafting the curriculum. And so if you are questioning, could you, should you, the answer is definitely yes. The risk of moving forward is far less than the risk of staying still. So, extremely impressive results. There are lots of likely processes you will engage in today. And we have done several visits with all our client schools. Some of you will probably be thinking, gosh, why do those people keep popping up in our lives? I think Louise has probably seen us about 4 or 5 times. We are happy to do that. And we know it's important because design thinking is very much about acting as a sounding board. If the first iteration isn't what you want, let's do it a second time. If that's not what you want, let's do it a third time. And Roberto's happy to contribute to that, as is Marcel and as is Bruce, and as am I. I'm not a brilliant designer. I leave that to the clever guys. I do the writing. And as I said earlier, that empathy is critical. If you don't have that empathy with your end users, which remember is not just your students, it's also your teachers and your parents. I do wonder whether politically and practically we made a huge gaffe as a country by investing, I don't know whether we invested that much, but we invested a little bit in our staff development over the last 30 or 40 years, but looking at NQT salaries, perhaps not much. But we certainly didn't invest in the environment. And I'm thinking now that for education to be successful, financial investment, intellectual capital, it goes as much into teacher development as it does into the learning environment, the designs of those environments. And if you wanted to push the case further, I would suggest there is an argument for investing more in the designed environment because A, it will last longer, and B, you have more control over it. Right. Launch sequence. Lewis, could we skip to the next one? Please? Hopefully. We have a recalcitrant set of algorithms, perhaps. There we are. So, design is intelligence made visible. I love that phrase. It's been bandied around a lot. It's one of Terence Conran's. If that is true, then our designs of our state schools speak for themselves. They're not very intelligent. Okay, and that unfortunately is perpetuated by a standardized rubric from government. If you are working in a state school or a building that was once state-owned and is now owned by yourselves, you'll still have that heritage. Standardization from government says they have to be built in the same way, same sizes, same allowance per student. So it's very hard to do the kinds of things that we're talking about today in those standardized environments. So launch sequence. Those of you who've done your masters and your PhDs, this is very like a research project. You take a methodological overview and you work out what's best for you in ethnography, whatever. For me, it looks very much like a case study as your best fit paradigm. You take a set of data, a set of interviews. They could be anecdotal, they might be empirical, and you create an intervention, which is the design of your environment, and then you look at it to see if it works. And you ask yourself, how do I capture that data? It is important because otherwise, you fall into the trap of just designing something that looks pretty. And you don't want it just to look pretty. Schools did that for years. You want it to look pretty because it does generate great marketing collateral, but you want to make an impact somewhere in your strategic development plan. That goes down a treat, obviously, with governors and especially with the bursar and with the estates manager, because look, we've done something on school, we've spent £200,000, £250,000, and we have an outcome in mind. And you know what? We know how we're going to measure it. What is there to argue against? Okay, so it does look like a case study. The process will be familiar for you there. Get your data together, get your quant together first, corroborate it with qual. What's it telling you about your environment? And you'll know that already. Qualitative data takes a number of forms. You can use algorithms as well. I found PASS incredibly useful as a semi-objective, semi-empirical insight into the success of our learning environments in Lagos, because PASS told us that pupils were a lot happier about school and they were a lot happier about themselves. And that would have been harder to capture objectively with something like SurveyMonkey and observations from teachers and parents. Although that's what we were being told, it was great to have a semi-empirical piece of data to confirm that. We have compound sequential meetings with yourselves, working our way through the design, layering it. It's multi-phased. That pupil voice is critical. As I said, when Bruce and I were in Birmingham this week, the power of the pupil voice and having ownership of that area was vast. To see a large class of girls saying, listen, sir, we want to feel positive when we get out of this environment. What a great thing to say. Can we design that? Yes, we can. Sound a bit like Bob the Builder there, don't I? So it becomes a community design, and you have a core strategy that you want to address specific outcomes. So you will want to know what the likely outcomes are. In other words, what's your why? A little quote there from Covey, not my favourite person in the whole world, but he does have some insight into management of change. Seek first to understand and then be understood. If we understand what the challenges are for our sixth formers and so on, we will build and design environments that suit their needs. What did I get? I got those immediate and short-term tangibles, all to do with well-being, engagement standards, inspection report. When my last but one school in Swansea was inspected by Eston, they really didn't get it. For 2 days they wandered around saying, well, you're only teaching 30% of the time. And I said, well, yes, but 70% of the time we're creating differentiated materials, rescaffolding the curriculum and engaging in this Socratic Harkness type process. On the third day, the guest inspector, who shall remain nameless, said, I get it. He said, you give pupils ownership of their pathways and that's why they're so engaged. bang, and he put that in the inspection report, and we got excellent for engagement, excellent for strategic partnerships, which in Wales is a challenge because Estyn are proper old-fashioned state apparatchiks. So in the independent sector, they do give you a roasting. You will get that. You will get your medium and long-term strategic derivatives, which can do with improving numbers, improving finance, improving standards, addressing behaviour, getting rid of bullying. Very interesting to see that one of the corollaries of going to a heutagogical environment where people become much more self-directed is bullying drops through the floor. Command and control is taken out of the classroom. Who models command and control? I do as a teacher. If I'm no longer modelling command and control, what behaviours are mimicked or imitated? Collaborative, collegiate, and so on. Future-proofing skills and character. I know from speaking to a lot of you here that there are challenges coming from parents. Parents are asking in the independent sector, what am I paying for? What are you doing to make sure my son or daughter will be successful in 2030 and 2040? And I think you as teachers and leaders need to have a strategic answer. You probably already do because you're all very clever people. But this cements your position. You can say we are crafting environments which foster character, foster skills, speak at once to the legacy of school and look forward to the future. So you address the parental inquiries, embedding digital and AI strategy. I'm fascinated that AI is at such a low level of use in the UK. To me, it was one of the core answers to dealing with COVID. AI that differentiates for pupil needs in and out of school, corrects the work, feeds back to teachers, feeds back to you as managers about who creates the least and most misperceptions and allows pupils a lot of different bites of the cherry in a lot of differentiated ways. Why wasn't it used? Discuss. There's a lot of thought there, but creating environments that foster that engagement with AI by building self-direction within learners, critical. The heutagogy is the self-direction, and that means if you create these environments, you've got to play with what the curriculum looks like a little bit. Chunk it down, build the questions around it, create the differentiated resources. No matter how sharp a learner, it's unlikely that the preponderance of learners will find their way through a one-size-fits-all curriculum. So whilst teachers might not be in front of classes as often as they once were, you can bet your life they'll be spending a lot more time crafting differentiated materials that can be worked through in places in your learning areas. It's a great counter-COVID measure. If pupils are familiar with learning by themselves and self-directing when they get out of school, they will carry on with that culture. And I think probably David will talk a little about Harkness. When you chat to Claire, you will also be talking about heutagogy, how autonomy, independence, self-regulation and so on come from these environments. Sorry, I hope you weren't nodding off there, Lewis, on the stool. Okay. I know when what I'm saying is really boring when people are looking at the clock, and when I'm getting really, really boring and they start shaking their watches to see if the time is still going forward. So hopefully I haven't bored people too much so far. Right, aesthetic generatives. Lewis, could we have a quick look? Right, so these are the things that need to go into those learning areas to make them mimic real life, to adumbrate or foreshadow what professional life will look like after school, in university, and in chosen careers. There's a horrifying statistic out at the moment, which is the biggest dropout rate in first year in Russell Group universities is from your graduates from the UK independent sector. And I suspect, even though I haven't read any research about it, that it's probably because there's a little bit too much cosseting, a little bit too much spoon feeding going on. So spoon feed a child all their lives, what do they learn? The shape of the spoon. All right? And I think that's a really important part of thinking when it comes to design thinking. How can we make these environments mimic, foreshadow, adumbrate, call it what you will, those professional spaces that people will go into post-school? That's a really critical piece of thought. And I know, as I said, I referenced earlier some of the dialogue with Joanne. How does school bridge into the world of work? How does it bridge into the world of university and professions? Because the traditional delivery of GCSE and A-level is not going to support that bridge. So that parallel of real-world environments, critical. One of my favourite words, epistemological flow and ascent. It's an old concept that comes from Kolb, that as you move up through a building, if you embed the skills and the knowledge required to get to the top, which is very often the sixth form area, where you can put in perhaps the toughest skills to generate, such as reading for inference, problem solving, synthesis and so on. That ascent through knowledge and skills, it can be built into your building. It can also be built onto a single level, where you move from a certain skill level to another skill level through your learning centre. And you can reflect that in the waymarking on your floors. And Roberto's done a fantastic job on a school, which he'll probably talk to you about later on. I went there and they had a tower with a window shaped like a key on it, and I thought, gosh, that's the portal to sixth form. The epistemological ascent is moving up through that tower to sixth form. And Roberto crafted a number of ideas, which I'm not going to tell you about because they're actually quite good fun to look at. But honestly, it looks like something that a large corporate entity would introduce into school. And it's a very clever way of valuing, if you like, the character, the skills and the knowledge you require to get there. And it's reflected continuously in the environment. Other things that came out of my experience: strategic relationships grew, boys' engagement off the Richter scale, girls' engagement with STEM, neurodiversity acculturation. Neurodiversity is a very popular term right now. We know that most of our environments are neurotypical. So they cater to people who sit right in the dead centre of traditional ways of learning. Given COVID, given changes in technology, given use of touchscreens, those environments now have to be much better at acculturing the neurodiverse amongst us. Thinking about environments that speak to the autistic child who just wants to go somewhere in the dark and sit quietly, and to the gregarious child who wants to ideate and collaborate with their most fun friends. That's what these environments must do. Okay? And you can do that through a number of ways, through lighting, seating shapes, colour, texture. Again, when Bruce and I were in the Midlands this week, it was lovely to see this young lady, and clearly had some learning challenges. And she said, "Sir," she said, "please don't put those same textures everywhere. It drives me mad." She said, "I can't do it." So in other words, she was telling us she gets overstimulated and she needed a variety of light, of colour and texture. And if you go and look on YouTube, there are some great architects' workbooks on there that talk you through the variations in light, colour and texture to create either high arousal, low arousal, depending on who or what is coming through your school. Exam results, as I said, your value added will go through the roof. Literacy will improve. Last summer, I kind of got my SEN results back, and I'm kind of looking at them through my fingers thinking, my goodness me, these are going to be terrible. It's been a real challenge. Bingo. Everybody's reading age was either in line or beyond their predictor. And there were two reasons for that. One, the learning environments they had used. Two, had encultured them to using AI. So I went and looked at the AI we were using, and our SEN users were also our biggest users of AI that was differentiating and crafting for them all the time. And that's why I'm pretty sure there was no impact on their reading. Baccalaureate skill set. I think the enrichment and enhancement you get from being in a semi-commercial crossover hybrid environment like this is invaluable. Never mind our A-levels and GCSEs. Yes, they're important, and yes, parents will ask you about them. But what can you craft from your campus, from your learning areas, that looks like a baccalaureate type qualification, that speaks to character, that speaks to mindset, that speaks to skill set? And as I said earlier on, get it right and you counter that first year dropout right. Lewis, could we have a look at the amplifying effect of school? So as I said earlier on, there is an argument now, and I'm sure youngsters will be thinking, why am I going to school? I can see my peers and even my parents and perhaps my older brother and sister doing university type qualifications mostly online. So therefore, why am I going to school? So we as design thinkers have to consider what is the value of being in schools. And I swiped that quote. I first heard Steve Jobs use it. It might be from Ranulph Fiennes. I'm not sure where it came from first. We can teach those skills and we can probably teach those knowledge. Can we teach character? Can we teach growth mindset? Can we teach those MCE type skills that will allow people to be successful? Again, we can start them off, but it will be the environment that amplifies them. I've referenced earlier on how the environment becomes the third teacher. A big one for those of you working in the independent sector will be marketing collateral. How does this area showcase the culture of my school? It will also amplify diversity. If we produce environments that have only one modality of discourse or disagreement, how are children supposed to become resilient? How are they supposed to develop the art of disagreeing well? So if you look at those environments and how they foster collaboration and interaction, you will get more resilient children who are comfortable at dealing with a diverse range of opinions. And they don't have to agree with them, but they've developed the art of disagreeing well. countering effectively those echo chambers of social media. One of my graduates in Lagos, he said, "Sir, this algorithm knows me better than my own mother." How right was he? How right was he? And if you are in an echo chamber, only used to listening to what it is you find in there, how do you ever deal with real life? Where is your resilience? That's the value of what you can do here. The flip side of that is you can also insulate students from the white noise of technology. Sorry guys. You can give places that are technology free, and some of your students will probably want that. Biophilia, Roberto, Joe, Rishi and the team, they will chat to you about the value of greens and blues and natural environments inside. They make us feel very comfortable. Uniform environments will make you feel threatened, and I'm not going to steal Rishi's thunder. He'll tell you a little bit about that as he walks around. We've talked about bridging the gap to university, we've talked about well-being, and we've talked about standardisation. So the deep dive, the last bit now, we're on the home lap, so if you're shaking your watch thinking, gosh, when's that old guy going to stop speaking, we're nearly there. So art is simply a right method of doing things. So for those of you who are the technophiles and the researchers, this is why it works. And I won't talk you through them all because we'll run out of time. My favourite, and I wouldn't call it a specialism, I love watching how natural light affects people. Again, Rishi will talk to you about some of his experiences, as will Nathan. Natural light engages you at a level that artificial light does not, for a number of reasons. My favourite reason is affordance perception. In natural light, you perceive the number of opportunities to act in a physical way on a much higher level. You spot more opportunities to engage with your colleagues and your friends. So if you want people to collaborate, to move forward, to have that high arousal, but that positive high arousal, the crafting of optical flow across a learning space is critical. We've also got to be thinking, as I'm sure you're all aware, because you're all very sharp people, we're about creating knowledge in these environments. How are our students and our children working with each other to generate and embed knowledge, a kind of project-based learning? You can test the theory of experiential learning yourself. Again, Mike will talk a little bit about Dewey, Lewin and Kolb, I'm sure, and others of that ilk. Bergson, great thinker, argued we could pass through the optimal phase of anything and not realise it. And I suspect that when this research was at its height 40, 50 years ago, we passed through that optimization and we didn't realise that this was the thinking we should capitalise on. It is a dynamic learning cycle. You will watch with your children. They will do something. They will reflect because you have given them spaces to reflect in. Railway carriages, quiet collaboration, noisy collaboration. It is a learning transaction between the environment and your students. That is a transaction. That's not a passive phase of learning. And this is all about measuring the process of learning. We're very performance orientated in the UK. We like our empirical stuff, but learning is a process. And the experiential learning, it encompasses all those facets I put there, the creativity, the problem solving and the decision making. And that's how it begins to address, through its future facingness, some of the queries you will have from parents. So Lewis, learning is a function of whole self. Right. When I was in Africa, I loved this phrase, to heal we must first recognise we are injured. And I think we are a little bit injured as a country and possibly as a species with our learning. And I think we've got to recognise that many of the environments we've put in place, many of the techniques, much of the thinking, it's not doing what it should. And it's unlikely that it will do what it could do if we carry on doing it. So there has to be a recognition. Back in 1870, the government of the day produced the first Education Act because it was really worried that British graduates from school would be less strong, less able than other graduates from around the world, and Britain would lose its place at the top of the empire as the apex predator, if you like. So that's why the government in 1871 said, right, Government Education Act, let's make sure everybody's fully skilled to do what we want them to. That's the kind of thinking I'm sure that will emanate from the group today. How do we create environments that carry on making people successful? Learning, as we know, and I think Mike's going to talk a little bit about this, it is a human adaptation. It comes from the whole person, not just an intellectual aspect. You remember the old saying, it takes the whole village to bring up a child. That's what these environments are about. Colleagues, peers, friends are all part of that upbringing process. There's a continual and ongoing reconstruction of how you work, And to be efficacious, learning is effectively relearning. You take something, you grapple with it, you relearn it, you come at it from a different angle. So it's that resolution of conflict, disagreement, and differences are good because we're shuttling constantly between what we do, a place to go and reflect about it, coming back with some more action. How do I feel about that? And thinking about it. And that's the sort of process of thought development that these environments are designed to stimulate. As I said earlier on, with risk management, the risk of moving forward is far less than the risk of staying still. Rather like the coyote in the old Roadrunner cartoons, he's gone off the edge of the cliff. He doesn't know it yet because he hasn't started to fall. But I think much of global education, it's in that position and it will fall. And that's why you are in a unique position, because you understand that you need to move forward. So to go back to my English links, oh, brave new world that has such people in it. That's Miranda in The Tempest. It's actually quite ironic because the people she's got are probably not the people that she needs. But hopefully today the people you've got are the people that you need. And this is a brave new world, and we can move forward with it, and we can create the kind of skills and character that people will need to be successful. So the cycle of experiential learning, it comes through a transformative process. We call it experience. And there I've just put down the reflective observation and active experimentation that doesn't just go on in a science classroom. It goes on throughout school. It goes on throughout the areas that you craft that are conducive to these behaviours. You will have to speak to your teachers with your redesigns to get the most out of them. You will have to change a bit of mindset. Pedagogy has to become heutagogy. Sage on the stage, guide on the side. It is a mindset change. That is something we can help you with because I've done it a lot. And there is, by the way, and I'm sure Claire and Mike will reference this later on, a major role for metacognition. One of the big focuses is helping children understand where I learn best and how I learn best. So when you let them loose in what you've designed, they know where to go. Design literacy, harmonizing with space. If you've been on our websites and you've seen some of the beautiful, beautiful furniture and spaces that Rishi and Nathan have put out, if a solution is not elegant, it's not a solution. Or paraphrased, why we don't use duct tape on our railway carriages. They've got to look and they've got to feel beautiful. They've got to be conducive to the touch. When it's not being used for learning, what is it being used for? It's aesthetic. Surely it's got to please the eye. It's got to please the mind. Otherwise, we're missing the trick. So experiential learning, and again for the theorists amongst you, this is the 4 related modes of how we work through experience. We concretize it. We think about it, we reflect, and then we experiment. It's a quadripartite structure, so when you're thinking about your designs that you want, how does your design speak to each phase of that thought process going on with a learner? All concepts come from the validity of sense. So percepts, what I think, turn into concepts, what I'm going to do with them. Literacy has a huge role to play, and I've not really talked about this. But the value of oracy, speaking and listening, when it comes to dialogue between facilitators or teachers and learners themselves is massive. And oracy, I think, has taken a big hit globally because of touchscreen technology. That's something that goes with metacognition that needs to be thought about regarding its enculturation from these environments. You will also see how deftly acoustics are managed in these environments. Those of you amongst you who like design will have spotted the baffles in the ceiling. They are all over. That's why my voice is not reverberating. And one of the biggest problems of collaborative spaces is noise. If you're a little bit neurodiverse, you won't want to be in there. And that area won't speak to you. So when you go around and Rishi and Nathan or any of the Envoplan team narrate what's going on in the space, you will see what's happening with acoustics. It's a subtlety, but it's a subtlety with massive value, as is the lighting, to do with high arousal, low arousal, and engagement. So if you create these collaborative areas, these are facets you've got to think about. Otherwise, they won't do what you want them to do. And I think I was in a school, Zal might want to talk to you about this later on, a beautiful collaborative space, but the reverb was not quite as well managed as it could have been. So the next stage is making sure the acoustics are there to suck up the reverb. So when people are collaborating, the neurodiverse are not wanting to peel off. It's also related to the process of brain function. I'm not going to talk about that today because I'm not a neurologist, but there is a lot out there. My last thought, why do design spaces work? So there's the cycle. Every head teacher loves a diagram. I don't know whether it sells concepts to people, but it does. The phrase up there, design adds value faster than it adds cost. I think when you're speaking to governors, bursars, colleagues, that is the critical summary of where we are. The more I invest in design, the more exponentially value grows in my school. In other words, learning, experience, enrichment and enhancement, they grow at a faster exponential rate than you will add money and investment and time into your school. I know, I've been there. I'm not some crusty old academic who's throwing a theory out to you. I've been across Africa, I've been to Russia, I've worked in the UK, Isle of Man. I know it works. And I know as a strategic concept, it is probably better than any other you can use. So summary, design spaces. And this goes back to where we started. The public is more familiar with bad design than good design. Think of the Austin Allegro and the Mini Metro back in the 1970s. We got familiar with them and we accepted them and they were rubbish. It is in effect conditioned to prefer bad design. What do we accept in our schools? Because that is what we live with. The new becomes threatening. This new research, which was new in the 70s and 80s, people were threatened by it, and the old reassuring. So that's the mindset we are up against. So we need the rationale for it, which I've talked to you a little bit about. The value of moving forward, the risk of moving forward is far less than the risk of staying still. All the other values we talked about earlier on. You know what the process is because you will experience it today. You know what the outcomes are. You can do a risk assessment. Move forward. The risk is less than staying still. You know what the theories are. You've got a chance to reflect today when Joe will coax that thinking out of you. You've got a chance to practice and play with our environments. A huge part of today is about making the abstract real. The theories are fine, but as Muhammad Ali said, world's greatest boxer, it's fine having a plan till someone punches you in the face. Okay? So you've got to get in there and you've got to get your hands dirty, so to speak, and play with it. Iteration and ideation, that's why Roberto and his team are here. If you want to get some prototypes out, like the chairs and the stools I demonstrated to you, and Lewis continues to demonstrate effectively over there, they're there to play with. And the ultimate transformation is, of course, not in the environment, but in your thought process. You leave here having been a teacher and having been a manager of teachers and a manager of teaching, and you've become a design thinker. All right. So thank you very much for listening. I hope I haven't gone on too long. I hope your watches are still moving forward. And now I'll hand you over to Michael, who's going to speak in a short while. But if anybody wants a quick cup of tea or a comfort break, I think we're not on with Michael until 1:45. Okay. Thank you all for listening.